The alarm clock buzzed at 6:30 a.m., but Bobby Martinez had been awake for hours. He lay in his small apartment staring at the ceiling, thinking about the day ahead. Today was different. Today was the day he had been waiting for, his disability, hearing at the courthouse. After months of paperwork, doctor visits, and sleepless nights worrying about his future, this was his chance to finally get the help he needed. Bobby slowly sat up in bed, feeling the familiar ache in his left leg where pieces of metal still lived under his skin. The doctors had tried to remove all the shrapnel 40 years ago when he came back from Vietnam, but some pieces were too close to important nerves. Better to leave them alone, the army doctor had said back then. Now, at 68, those tiny pieces of metal reminded him every morning that he was getting older. He walked to his small bathroom and looked in the mirror. The face looking back at him was weathered and lined, with gray hair that had once been thick and black. His brown eyes, though tired, still held the spark of determination that had gotten him through so much in life. Bobby had never been one to complain or ask for help, but his body was finally telling him it was time. The apartment was quiet except for the sound of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Bobby lived alone, and had for many years now. His wife, Maria, had passed away 5 years ago from cancer, and their children lived far away with families of their own. They called every week and visited when they could, but Bobby was proud and independent. He didn't want to be a burden to anyone. As he sipped his coffee, Bobby looked at the manila envelope sitting on his small kitchen table. Inside were all the papers he needed for today: medical records, doctor reports, and forms he had filled out in his careful handwriting. The writing wasn't as neat as it used to be because his hands shook a little now, but he had made sure every word was clear and every signature was in the right place. Next to the envelope sat a small wooden box that had belonged to his father. Bobby opened it carefully and took out a small medal attached to a light blue ribbon with white stars. The Medal of Honor. He had received it so long ago that sometimes it felt like it had happened to someone else. But the medal was real, and so were the memories of that day in Vietnam when everything changed. Bobby had been just 22 years old, a young soldier far from home, when his unit came under heavy attack. He could still remember the sound of bullets flying overhead and the cries of his wounded friends. Without thinking about his own safety, Bobby had run into the dangerous area again and again, carrying injured soldiers to safety. He had saved 7 men that day, getting wounded himself in the process. The ceremony where he received the medal had been overwhelming. There were cameras, important people in fancy uniforms, and his parents crying with pride. But Bobby had never felt comfortable with all the attention. To him, he had just done what anyone would do: help his friends when they needed it most. Now, decades later, Bobby rarely talked about his military service. His neighbors knew he was a veteran, but most had no idea about the medal sitting in the wooden box. He wasn't the type to brag or tell war stories. He had come home, married Maria, worked hard at different jobs, and tried to live a quiet, normal life. But normal had become harder and harder. The injuries from Vietnam had gotten worse with age. Walking was difficult, and some days the pain was so bad he could barely get out of bed. His memory wasn't as sharp as it used to be, and sometimes he felt confused in crowded places. The doctors said it was all connected to his time in the war, the physical wounds and the stress that never really went away. Bobby looked at the clock on his stove. It was already 8:01 a.m., and his hearing was at 10 rao. He needed to get ready. He walked slowly to his bedroom closet and pulled out his best clothes. There wasn't much to choose from. The brown pants were a little too big now because he had lost weight, and the white button-down shirt was starting to fray at the collar. But they were clean and pressed, and they would have to do. He put on his father's old work boots, the only good shoes he had left. They were scuffed and worn, but they still fit well and were comfortable to walk in. Bobby had always taken care of his things, making them last as long as possible. Growing up poor had taught him not to waste anything. Before leaving his apartment, Bobby pinned the Medal of Honor to his shirt. He didn't do this often, but today felt important. Maybe it would help the people at the courthouse understand that he wasn't trying to cheat the system or get something he didn't deserve. He was a man who had served his country, and now needed his country's help in return. The bus ride to downtown took 30 minutes. Bobby sat near the front watching the city wake up around him. People hurried to work, children waited at bus stops for school, and the morning traffic was already getting heavy. He thought about all the mornings he had made the same trip when he was younger and stronger, going to work at the factory or the warehouse jobs that had kept his family fed and housed. As the bus got closer to the courthouse, Bobby felt his stomach tighten with nervousness. He had never been good with official meetings or dealing with government offices. The forms were confusing, the rules seemed to change all the time, and everyone always seemed to be in a hurry. But he knew he had to do this. His small pension wasn't enough to cover his medical bills, and he needed help to stay in his apartment. The courthouse was a big, imposing building made of gray stone with tall columns and many steps leading to the entrance. Bobby had walked past it many times over the years but had never needed to go inside. Now, looking up at it, he felt small and out of place. This was a building for important people, lawyers and judges and politicians. What was an old factory worker like him doing here? But Bobby straightened his shoulders and began the slow climb up the steps. Each step was harder than the last because of his bad leg, and he had to stop twice to catch his breath. A few people passed him on their way up, walking quickly in their expensive suits and shiny shoes. None of them looked at him or offered to help, which was fine with Bobby. He had been taking care of himself for a long time. At the top of the steps, Bobby paused and looked back at the street below. Cars and buses moved steadily past, carrying people to their jobs and appointments. Life was going on normally for everyone else, but for Bobby, today could change everything. If the hearing went well, he might finally get the help he needed. If it didn't, he wasn't sure what he would do next. Bobby took a deep breath and walked toward the large glass doors of the courthouse. Inside, he could see people moving around, and bright lights, and the kind of organized chaos that happens in government buildings. He checked his pocket one more time to make sure he had his paperwork, touched the metal on his chest for luck, and stepped inside to face whatever was waiting for him. The courthouse lobby was buzzing with morning activity when Bobby walked through the heavy glass doors. The sound hit him first, voices echoing off the high ceiling, footsteps clicking on the marble floor, and the constant beeping of the metal detector. The bright fluorescent lights made everything look harsh and cold, so different from the warm sunlight outside. Bobby joined the line for security, clutching his manila envelope tightly. In front of him, a woman in a sharp business suit tapped, her foot impatiently while checking her phone. Behind him, a young man in khakis shuffled through a stack of legal papers. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they were going and what they were doing. Bobby felt like he was the only one who didn't belong. The security guard at the front of the line was a heavy-set man in his 30s named Officer Stevens. He had been working courthouse security for 3 years, and in that time, he had developed strong opinions about the types of people who came through those doors. There were the lawyers and judges who belonged there, the nervous citizens with legitimate business, and then there were the troublemakers, the homeless people looking for a warm place to sit, the mentally unstable individuals who wandered in confused, and the petty criminals trying to cause problems. As Stevens watched Bobby approach, he quickly sized him up. The old man's clothes were clean but clearly worn and outdated. His pants were too loose, his shirt had seen better days, and those work boots looked like they belonged on a construction site, not in a courthouse. The way Bobby moved slowly and seemed uncertain made Stevens think he might be dealing with someone who was confused or didn't have legitimate business in the building. When Bobby reached the metal detector, Stevens barely looked up from his clipboard. "Empty your pockets, remove your belt, and step through," he said in a bored tone, the same instructions he gave dozens of times every day. Bobby did as he was told, placing his keys, some coins, and his wallet in the plastic tray. But when he stepped through the metal detector, it immediately started beeping loudly. The sound made Bobby jump a little, and he looked around confused. "Step back and try again," Stevens said, still not really paying attention. Bobby stepped back and walked through again, but the machine beeped even louder this time. Now people in line behind him were starting to look annoyed, checking their watches and sighing. "Sir, do you have any metal on you?" Stevens asked, finally, looking directly at Bobby. That's when he noticed the small medal pinned to Bobby's shirt, but to Stevens it just looked like some kind of cheap decoration or pin. He had no idea what a Medal of Honor looked like or what it meant. "I have some metal in my leg," Bobby said quietly, his voice barely audible over the noise in the lobby. "From the war. The doctors couldn't take it all out." Stevens rolled his eyes. He had heard every excuse in the book from people trying to get through security with contraband. "Sure you do," he muttered under his breath. "Step to the side, sir. I need to use the metal detecting wand." Bobby moved to the side as instructed, feeling embarrassed as more people gathered behind him in line. The security wand beeped loudly when Stevens passed it over Bobby's left leg, confirming that there was indeed metal there. But instead of believing Bobby's explanation, Stevens became more suspicious. Why would someone lie about having metal in their body unless they were trying to hide something? "What's your business in the courthouse today?" Stevens asked, his tone becoming more stern and official. Bobby fumbled with his envelope, his hands shaking slightly from nerves. "I have a hearing," he said, trying to show Stevens his paperwork. "For disability benefits. It's at 10 o'clock. Stevens barely glanced at the papers Bobby was holding out. He was more focused on Bobby's nervous behavior, the way his hands were shaking and his general appearance. In Stevens' experience, legitimate courthouse visitors were usually more confident and put together. This old man seemed confused and out of place. "Where exactly is this hearing supposed to be?" Stevens asked, crossing his arms. Bobby looked at his papers again, trying to find the right information. The courthouse was much bigger than he had expected, and the noise and crowds were making it hard for him to think clearly. "I think it's the disability office? On the second floor, maybe?" Stevens shook his head. Bobby's uncertainty confirmed his suspicions. People with real appointments usually knew exactly where they were going. "There's no disability office on the second floor," he said, which wasn't entirely true, but Stevens wasn't really trying to be helpful at this point. "I'm sorry," Bobby said, his voice getting quieter. "I'm not sure. The letter just said to come to the courthouse at 10 o'clock. Maybe you could help me find the right place." But Stevens had already made up his mind about Bobby. The old man's confusion, his shabby appearance, and his nervous behavior all pointed to someone who didn't have legitimate business in the courthouse. Stevens had seen it before: homeless people or confused elderly individuals who wandered into government buildings looking for help or just a place to sit. "Sir, I'm going to need you to move along," Stevens said loudly, his voice carrying across the lobby. "This is a courthouse, not a social services office. If you need help, you should go to the welfare office down the street." Bobby felt his face get hot with embarrassment. Several people nearby had stopped what they were doing to watch the interaction. "But I have an appointment," he said, holding up his papers again. "I've been waiting for months for this hearing." Stevens didn't even look at the papers this time. "Sir, you're holding up the line and causing a disturbance. I'm going to need you to leave the building now." Bobby couldn't believe what was happening. He had served his country, fought in a war, and earned the highest honor the military could give. Now he was being treated like a vagrant who didn't belong in a public building. The small medal on his chest suddenly felt heavy, but Stevens hadn't given it a second glance. "Please," Bobby said, his voice starting to break. "I just need to find where my hearing is. I've been waiting so long for this appointment." But Stevens had already decided that Bobby was a problem that needed to be removed. He reached for his radio to call for backup, speaking loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "I need assistance at the front security checkpoint. We have a situation with an individual who's refusing to leave the building." The word "situation" made everyone in the lobby turn to look at Bobby, who was standing there holding his envelope of papers, looking lost and humiliated. A few people took out their phones, some to record what was happening, others to check the time because the commotion was making them late for their own appointments. Bobby felt the walls of the courthouse closing in around him. The bright lights seemed too harsh, the voices too loud, and the stares of the other people too judgmental. He had faced enemy fire in Vietnam without backing down, but this public humiliation in a place where he should have been treated with respect was breaking something inside him. Within minutes, 2 more security guards arrived to assist Stevens. They looked at Bobby, this elderly man in worn clothes holding legal papers, and immediately assumed he was the troublemaker their colleague had called about. None of them took the time to actually examine his paperwork or ask detailed questions about his appointment. "Sir, we're going to need you to come with us," one of the backup guards said, taking Bobby gently but firmly by the arm. "You need to leave the building now." Bobby looked around desperately, hoping someone would speak up for him or ask to see his papers properly. But everyone was busy with their own business, and the few people who seemed sympathetic were too intimidated by the security guards to get involved. As they started walking him toward the exit, Bobby's heart sank. His hearing was in less than an hour, and instead of sitting in a waiting room preparing for the most important appointment of his life, he was being escorted out of the building like a criminal. The Medal of Honor on his chest had failed to protect him from this humiliation, just as his military service had failed to protect him from poverty and pain in his old age. The 3 security guards formed a triangle around Bobby as they began walking him toward the courthouse exit. Each step felt like a mile to the elderly veteran, who clutched his manila envelope against his chest like it was the most precious thing in the world. The sound of their footsteps echoed through the marble lobby, and Bobby could feel dozens of eyes watching him as they moved through the crowd. "Please, just look at my papers," Bobby whispered to the guard holding his left arm. "I have a hearing in 40 minutes. I've been waiting for this appointment since December." Officer Johnson, one of the backup guards who had responded to Stevens's call, glanced down at Bobby with a mixture of annoyance and what might have been pity. Johnson was younger than Stevens, maybe 25, and he had only been working courthouse security for 6 months. Part of him felt uncomfortable about removing an elderly man who seemed genuinely confused rather than threatening, but Stevens was his supervisor, and he didn't want to question his judgment in front of everyone. "Sir, you can file a complaint or reschedule your appointment," Johnson said quietly, trying to keep his voice low so fewer people would stare. "But right now, we need you to leave the building." Bobby's legs were starting to feel weak. The combination of stress, embarrassment, and the physical strain of standing for so long was taking its toll on his 68-year-old body. The shrapnel in his left leg was sending sharp pains up to his hip, and his heart was beating too fast. He hadn't felt this panicked since his early days back from Vietnam, when loud noises and crowds would sometimes overwhelm him. As they approached the main entrance, Bobby could see people outside on the courthouse steps going about their morning business. Some were lawyers walking quickly while talking on their phones. Others were citizens like himself coming for hearings and appointments. The thought of being forced to sit outside with those people while his important hearing happened without him made Bobby feel desperate. "I served in Vietnam," Bobby said loudly, his voice cracking with emotion. "I fought for this country. I earned the right to be in this building." A few people nearby turned to look, and Bobby noticed a woman with gray hair slow down her walking to listen. She was carrying a briefcase and wearing the kind of clothes that suggested she worked in the courthouse, maybe a clerk or administrator. For a moment, Bobby thought she might say something to help him, but Stevens gave her a sharp look and she hurried away. "Sir, everyone appreciates your service," Stevens said in a tone that suggested he didn't really mean it. "But that doesn't give you the right to cause disturbances in federal buildings. We have procedures here and you need to follow them like everyone else." Bobby wanted to scream that he hadn't caused any disturbance, that all he had done was set off a metal detector because of injuries he received serving his country, but his voice seemed to be getting smaller and weaker with each word he spoke. The noise of the lobby, conversations, footsteps, phones ringing, security radios crackling, was becoming overwhelming. They were almost to the exit now, just 20 feet from the heavy glass doors that would separate Bobby from his hearing. Through the glass he could see the concrete steps where he had paused earlier that morning, gathering courage to enter the building. Now those same steps would be where he would sit in defeat, watching other people go inside to handle their business while his own future slipped away. "Wait," Bobby said, stopping suddenly and causing the guards to stumble slightly. Please, just look at this medal. Do you know what this is? For the first time, Stevens actually looked at the small blue ribbon with white stars pinned to Bobby's shirt. But Stevens had grown up playing video games and watching action movies. To him, military medals were just props or decorations. He had no idea that he was looking at the Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States, given only to service members who showed extraordinary valor in combat. It's a nice pin, sir, Stevens said dismissively. But wearing military decorations doesn't give you special privileges in this courthouse. Now please cooperate with us so this doesn't have to get more difficult. Bobby felt something break inside his chest. Not his heart exactly, but something deeper. His faith that the country he had served would treat him with basic dignity and respect. The medal that had once represented the proudest moment of his life now felt like a worthless piece of metal that no one cared about or understood. As they reached the glass doors, Bobby's knees started to buckle. The pain in his leg was getting worse, and the stress of the situation was making him feel dizzy and nauseous. Johnson, the younger guard, noticed Bobby swaying and loosened his grip slightly. "Are you okay, sir?" Johnson asked, genuine concern, creeping into his voice for the first time. "I don't feel good," Bobby admitted, his face pale and sweaty. "My leg is hurting really bad, and I think I need to sit down." Stevens looked annoyed by this development. The last thing he wanted was for this old man to collapse inside the courthouse and create an even bigger scene. "You can sit down outside," he said, pushing open the glass door. "There are benches on the steps." The morning air hit Bobby's face as they stepped outside, and for a moment he felt a little better. But then the reality of his situation crashed over him like a wave. He was outside the courthouse. His hearing was in 35 minutes, and he had no idea how to get back inside or who to call for help. The guards released his arms once they were clear of the building, and Bobby immediately sat down heavily on the concrete steps. His manila envelope fell from his hands and some of the papers scattered in the light breeze. Johnson bent down to help collect them, but Stevens grabbed his arm. "Leave it," Stevens said. "He's not our problem anymore." Bobby sat on the cold concrete, watching his important documents blow around his feet while people walked past him up the steps and into the courthouse. Some people glanced at him with curiosity, others with disapproval, and most just ignored him completely. He was invisible now, just another elderly man sitting on government steps clutching papers that no one wanted to see. A businesswoman in expensive shoes stepped carefully around Bobby as she climbed the steps, holding her purse a little tighter to her body. A group of young lawyers chatted and laughed as they passed him, their voices fading as they disappeared through the doors. Bobby was no longer allowed to enter. 20 minutes until his hearing, and Bobby sat alone on the courthouse steps, feeling smaller and more forgotten than he had ever felt in his entire life. The Medal of Honor on his chest caught the morning sunlight, its blue ribbon bright against his faded white shirt, but it might as well have been invisible for all the good it was doing him now. Bobby closed his eyes and tried to remember the words his drill sergeant had taught him 50 years ago. A soldier never gives up, never surrenders, and always completes the mission. But sitting on those cold steps, surrounded by scattered papers and ignored by the world, Bobby wondered if maybe it was finally time to give up. Maybe he was just too old, too poor, and too forgotten for anyone to care about his mission anymore. Inside the courthouse, Judge Patricia Williams was reviewing her morning schedule when her clerk, Mrs. Chen, knocked on her chamber door. Judge Williams had been on the bench for 15 years, and in that time, she had developed a reputation for being tough but fair. More importantly, she had a special place in her heart for veterans, largely because of her own father's service in World War II. "Your Honor," Mrs. Chen said, stepping into the office with a concerned expression. There was some kind of incident in the lobby this morning. Security removed an elderly man who claimed he had a hearing today. Judge Williams looked up from her papers, her brow furrowed. "What kind of incident? Was someone causing trouble?" "I'm not sure about the details," Mrs. Chen replied. "But Officer Stevens said the man was confused and didn't seem to have legitimate business here. He was asking about a disability hearing, but Stevens said he couldn't find any record of an appointment." Something about this didn't sit right with Judge Williams. In her experience, elderly veterans often had difficulty navigating the complex courthouse system, but that didn't mean they didn't belong there. Her own father had struggled with paperwork and government offices after the war, often becoming confused or overwhelmed by bureaucracy. "Did anyone actually look at his documentation?" she asked. Mrs. Chen shrugged. "I don't think so." Stevens said the man seemed confused and was holding up the security line. Judge Williams felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. She had seen too many cases where veterans fell through the cracks of the system, dismissed or ignored by people who didn't understand their sacrifices or their needs. Her father had always told her stories about how difficult it was for soldiers to readjust to civilian life, especially when dealing with injuries and trauma that others couldn't see. "Where is this man now?" Judge Williams asked, standing up from her desk. "I believe security escorted him outside," Mrs. Chen replied. "Judge, your next case starts in 20 minutes. Should I delay the schedule?" But Judge Williams was already putting on her robe. Something was telling her she needed to investigate this situation personally. Maybe it was her father's voice in her head, or maybe it was just her sense of justice, but she couldn't sit in her comfortable chambers while an elderly veteran might be sitting outside confused and abandoned by the very system he had served. "Reschedule my 10 o'clock, she said, walking toward the door. "I need to check on something first." Judge Williams walked through the courthouse corridors with purpose, her heels clicking on the marble floor. Other court employees nodded respectfully as she passed, but she barely noticed them. Her mind was focused on finding this elderly man and understanding what had really happened. When she reached the main lobby, she found Officer Stevens back at his security station, looking pleased with himself for handling what he considered a successful removal of a problem individual. Judge Williams approached him with the calm authority that had served her well in courtrooms for years. "Officer Stevens," she said, her voice carrying just enough edge to get his full attention. "I understand you removed someone from the building this morning." Stevens straightened up immediately. He knew Judge Williams by reputation and had always been a little intimidated by her. "Yes, Your Honor. Elderly gentleman causing a disturbance. Claimed he had some kind of hearing, but he seemed confused and was holding up the security line." "Did you examine his paperwork?" Judge Williams asked. He was waving some papers around, but they looked like typical homeless documentation. "You know how it is. They collect all sorts of official-looking papers to try to get into government buildings." Judge Williams felt her jaw tighten. "Officer Stevens, did you actually look at what those papers were?" Stevens shifted uncomfortably. "Well, no ma'am, not exactly. But his behavior and appearance suggested he didn't have legitimate business here." "His appearance?" Judge Williams repeated, her voice getting colder. "And what exactly did that tell you about his right to be in a public courthouse?" Before Stevens could answer, Judge Williams was already walking toward the exit. She pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped outside, immediately scanning the courthouse steps for the man who had been removed. She found Bobby sitting on the concrete steps about halfway down, his head in his hands, looking defeated and broken. His manila envelope lay beside him, some papers still scattered around his feet in the morning breeze. Judge Williams felt her heart sink as she took in the scene. This elderly man, clearly struggling, abandoned on the steps of justice, as they were. She walked down toward Bobby. Something caught her eye. The morning sunlight was hitting his shirt at just the right angle, and she could see a small medal pinned to his chest. Judge Williams had grown up in a military family. Her father had been a sergeant in the Pacific Theater, and she had spent countless hours at Veterans Day ceremonies and military museums. She knew military decorations better than most civilians. When she got close enough to see the light blue ribbon with white stars clearly, Judge Williams stopped walking entirely. Her breath caught in her throat. She was looking at a Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration in the United States, given only to service members who had shown extraordinary valor in combat above and beyond the call of duty. Judge Williams had only seen a Medal of Honor twice in her life, once in a museum and once at a ceremony honoring World War II veterans. She knew that fewer than 3,500 people had ever received this honor, and that many of the recipients had died earning it. The man sitting on these courthouse steps was a genuine American hero. "Sir?" she said gently, approaching Bobby with the reverence her father had taught her to show all veterans. "Excuse me, sir?" Bobby looked up, his eyes red and tired. When he saw the woman in judicial robe standing in front of him, he tried to stand up, but his injured leg made the movement difficult and painful. Judge Williams immediately held up her hand. "Please don't get up," she said kindly. "I'm Judge Williams. I work here in the courthouse and I wanted to talk to you about what happened this morning." Bobby looked at her with confusion and hope, mixed together. "Ma'am, I had a hearing scheduled for 10 o'clock. I've been waiting months for this appointment, but the security guard said I didn't belong here. They wouldn't look at my papers." Judge Williams knelt down beside Bobby, not caring that her expensive robe was touching the concrete steps. She looked directly at the Medal of Honor on his chest, then back into his weathered face. "Sir, may I ask your name?" "Bobby Martinez, ma'am. I served in Vietnam with the 1st Infantry Division." Judge Williams felt tears forming in her eyes. "Mr. Martinez, I see that you're wearing the Medal of Honor. Would you mind telling me how you earned it?" Bobby's expression changed completely. For the first time that morning, someone was treating him with respect and asking about his service, rather than dismissing him. "Yes, ma'am. It was in 1969 near the Cambodian border. My unit was ambushed and several of my friends were wounded and trapped in an open area. I went back for them, 7 times total, until everyone was safe. Got pretty torn up myself, but everyone made it home." Judge Williams had to swallow hard before she could speak again. She was sitting next to a man who had risked his life multiple times to save his fellow soldiers, a man who represented the very best of American courage and sacrifice. And that same man had been treated like garbage by her courthouse security just an hour earlier. "Mr. Martinez," she said, her voice thick with emotion and respect, "I am so sorry for what happened to you this morning. What you experienced was completely wrong, and it should never have happened. Would you please allow me to personally escort you back inside? I believe we need to get you to your hearing immediately." Judge Williams helped Bobby gather his scattered papers from the courthouse steps, treating each document with the same care she would give to important legal files. Bobby watched in amazement as this distinguished woman in judicial robes knelt beside him, carefully collecting his disability forms and medical records that had been blowing around in the morning breeze. "Mr. Martinez," Judge Williams said as she handed him the manila envelope, "I want you to know that what happened to you this morning does not represent the values of this courthouse or this country. You deserve so much better than the treatment you received." Bobby felt tears forming in his eyes. After hours of being dismissed and disrespected, having someone finally treat him with dignity felt overwhelming. "Thank you, ma'am," he said quietly. "I was starting to think maybe I didn't belong here after all." "You belong here more than anyone," Judge Williams replied firmly. "You've earned the right to be treated with respect in every government building in this country." As they walked back up the courthouse steps together, Bobby moving slowly due to his injured leg, Judge Williams could see people starting to notice them. A federal judge personally escorting an elderly veteran was not something that happened every day. Word began to spread quickly through the courthouse that something significant was taking place. When they reached the main entrance, Officer Stevens was still at his security station. Judge Williams walked directly to him, with Bobby beside her, and the authority in her voice was unmistakable. "Officer Stevens," she said, loud enough for others nearby to hear, "I want you to take a very close look at this gentleman's medal." Stevens looked uncomfortable as he focused on the blue ribbon with white stars pinned to Bobby's shirt. Even though he still didn't fully understand what he was looking at, the judge's tone told him it was something important. "This is the Medal of Honor," Judge Williams explained, her voice carrying across the lobby. "It's the highest military decoration our country can bestow. It's given only to service members who show extraordinary courage in combat, risking their own lives to save others. Mr. Martinez here saved 7 of his fellow soldiers in Vietnam, despite being wounded himself." The lobby had grown quieter as people stopped their conversations to listen. Stephen's face was turning red as he began to understand the magnitude of his mistake. He had removed a genuine American hero from the courthouse, treating him like a vagrant or troublemaker. "Sir, I didn't know," Stephen stammered. "I'm sorry, I should have looked more carefully at his paperwork." "Yes, you should have," Judge Williams replied. "But more importantly, you should have treated him with basic dignity regardless of his appearance or how he was dressed. Every person who enters this courthouse deserves respect until proven otherwise." Bobby watched this exchange with mixed feelings. Part of him was grateful that someone was finally standing up for him, but another part felt embarrassed by all the attention. He had never been comfortable being the center of attention, even when receiving his medal all those years ago. Judge Williams turned to Bobby. "Mr. Martinez, your hearing was scheduled for 10 o'clock, which means we're already 30 minutes late. Would you like me to personally ensure that your case is heard today?" "Yes, ma'am, if that's possible," Bobby replied. "I've been waiting for this hearing since December. It's really important for my future." "Then let's make sure it happens," Judge Williams said with determination. As they walked through the courthouse corridors toward the disability hearing office, something remarkable began to happen. Word of Bobby's story had spread through the building with the speed that only courthouse gossip could achieve. Clerks, lawyers, bailiffs, and other court personnel began emerging from their offices to see the Medal of Honor recipient who had been wrongfully ejected. But they didn't just look. They began to applaud. It started with Mrs. Chen, Judge Williams' clerk, who began clapping softly as they passed her office. Then other court employees joined in. Soon the entire hallway was filled with the sound of applause, and Bobby found himself walking down a corridor lined with people showing him the respect he should have received from the moment he entered the building. Bobby had to stop walking for a moment. The emotion was overwhelming. These people didn't know him personally, but they understood what his medal represented. They understood the sacrifice he had made for his country, and they wanted to honor that sacrifice. For the first time in years, Bobby felt truly appreciated for his service. A young paralegal named Katie stepped forward from the crowd. She was probably the same age Bobby had been when he served in Vietnam, and there were tears in her eyes as she approached him. "Thank you for your service, Mr. Martinez," she said simply. "My grandfather served in Vietnam too. He would have been proud to meet you." Similar words came from others in the hallway. "Thank you for your service. We're honored to have you here. You're a true hero." Each phrase felt like healing medicine to Bobby's wounded spirit. When they reached the disability hearing office, Judge Williams spoke directly to the hearing administrator. "This is Robert Martinez," she said. "He had a 10 o'clock hearing that was delayed due to a security misunderstanding. I want to ensure his case receives immediate attention." The administrator, who had also heard about what happened, immediately ushered Bobby into a conference room where his hearing officer was waiting. Judge Williams squeezed Bobby's shoulder gently before he went in. "You've got this, Mr. Martinez," she said. "Tell them your story honestly, just like you told me." The hearing itself went smoothly. Bobby's medical records clearly documented his service-connected injuries, and his modest financial situation qualified him for the assistance he needed. The hearing officer, who had served in the military himself, treated Bobby with the respect and dignity that had been missing from his morning experience. 45 minutes later, Bobby emerged from the hearing room with good news. His disability benefits had been approved, which meant he would receive monthly payments to help cover his medical expenses and living costs. More importantly, he would have access to better health care through the Veterans Administration. Judge Williams was waiting for him in the hallway, along with several courthouse employees who wanted to hear the outcome. When Bobby shared his good news, another round of applause erupted. But the day wasn't over yet. Judge Williams had arranged for Officer Stevens and the other security guards to meet with Bobby personally. When Stevens approached, he looked genuinely ashamed of his earlier behavior. "Mr. Martinez," Stevens said, his voice shaking slightly, "I owe you a sincere apology. I made assumptions about you based on your appearance, and I was completely wrong. You deserved better treatment, and I promise you that I will never make the same mistake again." Bobby looked at the young man who had humiliated him just hours earlier. He could have been angry, could have demanded punishment or consequences. Instead, he extended his hand for a handshake. "We all make mistakes," Bobby said simply. "The important thing is that we learn from them. That handshake became the foundation for significant changes in courthouse security procedures. New training programs were implemented to help security personnel better recognize and respect veterans. Pictures and descriptions of military medals, especially the Medal of Honor, were posted at all security stations. Most importantly, all courthouse employees received training on treating every visitor with dignity and respect. Bobby's story spread beyond the courthouse walls. Local news stations picked up the story of the Medal of Honor recipient who was wrongfully ejected and then honored by the judge who recognized his service. The story resonated with people across the country, serving as a reminder that heroes don't always look the way we expect them to. 6 months later, Bobby was invited back to the courthouse for a special ceremony. Judge Williams presented him with a key to the city and officially declared him an honored guest who would always be welcome in any government building. But more importantly, Bobby's story had changed how people in the courthouse thought about service, sacrifice, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. As Bobby walked out of the courthouse that day, 6 months after his ordeal, he wore his Medal of Honor with renewed pride, not because it had finally gotten him the recognition he deserved, but because it had helped teach an important lesson about respect, assumptions, and the heroes who walk among us every day.